For 3,000 years, Homer's tales of the Trojan War lived in the realm of legend. Scholars treated the siege of Troy as myth, a story spun by poets around ancient fires, embellished with each retelling until truth and fiction became indistinguishable. The great bronze-clad warriors, the kings who commanded fleets, the palaces that stretched across windswept hills, all of it seemed the product of imagination rather than history. Then, in the late 1800s, archaeologists began turning soil in the Aegean. What they uncovered transformed everything. Beneath layers of earth lay the ruins of massive palace complexes, their walls constructed from stones so enormous that later civilizations believed only giants could have moved them. These cyclopean fortifications stood as silent testimony to a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that had flourished from roughly 1600 BCE through its peak during the late Helladic III period, spanning 1400 to 1100 BCE. Within royal tombs, excavators discovered treasure, golden masks, intricate weapons, precious ornaments that spoke of unimaginable wealth and power. But perhaps more revealing were the clay tablets inscribed with Linear B script, palace records that documented the mundane details of administration, trade, and warfare. These fragments of bureaucracy proved that the Mycenaeans were not myth, they were real. They built empires, commanded armies, and ultimately watched their world collapse into darkness. The question that emerged was profound: what truly happened at Troy? The story of the Mycenaeans begins not with conquest or glory, but with emergence. Around 1600 before the Common Era, on the Greek mainland, a civilization was taking shape. It would not announce itself with fanfare or grand proclamations. Instead, it grew quietly, drawing strength from the people who inhabited the Peloponnese, that mountainous peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, where steep valleys gave way to fertile plains and rocky coastlines opened onto azure waters. These early Mycenaeans did not appear from nowhere. They inherited knowledge from those who came before them, particularly from the Minoans on the island of Crete, whose sophisticated culture had already flourished for centuries. The Mycenaeans absorbed the artistic sensibilities, the religious practices, and the maritime expertise of their predecessors. They learned how to navigate trade routes, how to build with stone, how to organize complex societies. But they would transform these lessons into something distinctly their own, something more martial, more hierarchical, more focused on the consolidation of power through architecture and warfare. The landscape itself shaped them. The Peloponnese is not a land of gentle slopes and open plains. It is a region of dramatic elevation changes, where mountains create natural barriers between communities. These geographical constraints forced the Mycenaeans to become skilled builders and strategists. They had to construct fortifications that could protect their settlements. They had to develop networks of communication and trade that could overcome the physical isolation of their valleys and plateaus. They had to build societies resilient enough to survive in a challenging environment while remaining connected to the broader Mediterranean world. By the period known as the Late Helladic, roughly 1400 to 1100 before the Common Era, the Mycenaeans had reached the zenith of their power and influence. This was their golden age, the era that would later inspire Homer's epics. Yet, the Mycenaeans themselves left no written poetry, no philosophical treatises that survived to the modern world. What they left behind was something more tangible: stone, clay, and the fragments of their daily lives preserved in the earth. The most striking testimony to Mycenaean achievement lies in their architecture. At sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, massive stone structures still stand as monuments to their engineering prowess. The walls of these fortifications are so enormous that later Greeks believed they could only have been built by giants, the Cyclopes of mythology. The stones themselves, some weighing several tons, were fitted together with such precision that mortar was often unnecessary. These cyclopean walls, as archaeologists call them, represent one of the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world. They were not merely defensive structures, they were statements of power, declarations that the Mycenaeans possessed the resources, the organization, and the vision to reshape their landscape. Tiryns, situated near Mycenae in the Peloponnese, exemplifies this architectural ambition. Its fortress rose dramatically from the plain, its walls creating concentric rings of protection. Within these walls lay the palace, the administrative heart of Mycenaean society. Here, rulers conducted their affairs, stored their treasures, and demonstrated their authority. The construction of such a fortress required not only skilled architects and laborers, but also a society capable of organizing hundreds of workers, supplying them with food and tools, and maintaining the vision of the project across years or decades. To the south, at Pylos in southwestern Greece, another palace complex tells a different but equally revealing story. Unlike the heavily fortified Mycenae and Tiryns, Pylos was more open, more spacious. Its palace was well preserved by the very catastrophe that would eventually destroy it, a fire that sealed the clay tablets within its rooms, protecting them from the ravages of time. These tablets, inscribed in a writing system called Linear B, would become the most direct window into Mycenaean life and thought. Linear B was not invented by the Mycenaeans. They adapted it from an earlier script used by the Minoans. But the Mycenaeans employed this writing system for a purpose very different from artistic or religious expression. The tablets found at Pylos and at Knossos on Crete are almost entirely administrative records. They document inventories of grain, lists of personnel, records of textile production, accounts of military equipment. These are the mundane records of palace economics, yet they are invaluable to historians seeking to understand how Mycenaean society actually functioned. The tablets reveal a society of remarkable complexity. Beneath the king stood a sophisticated bureaucracy: scribes, administrators, military officers, and overseers. The palaces maintained detailed accounts of resources flowing in and out. Artisans worked under state supervision, producing pottery, textiles, and metalwork. The palaces controlled vast agricultural lands and collected taxes in the form of grain and other commodities. This was not a simple warrior society. It was an organized state capable of mobilizing resources on a massive scale. Yet, the Mycenaeans were indeed warriors. The tablets mention military units, weapons, and fortifications. The artistic representations found in Mycenaean palaces frequently depict armed men, hunting scenes, and scenes of combat. The graves of Mycenaean elite, excavated by archaeologists in the 19th century, contain swords, spears, and armor that testify to a culture that valued martial prowess. The palace walls themselves, those imposing cyclopean fortifications, speak to a world where conflict was anticipated, where security mattered, where a ruler's power was measured partly by his ability to defend his territory. The Mycenaeans were also traders on a scale that connected them to the entire Mediterranean and beyond. Archaeological evidence reveals Mycenaean pottery and artifacts in Egypt, in the Levant, in Anatolia, and throughout the islands of the Aegean Sea. In return, Mycenaean palaces imported cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and ivory from various sources. This was not casual trade, it was systematic commerce controlled and organized by the palace. Merchants and traders operated under royal supervision, moving goods along established routes, establishing relationships with foreign powers. The climate during this Mycenaean period was generally similar to the Mediterranean climate of today: warm summers and mild winters that allowed for the cultivation of olive trees, grapevines, and grain crops. The people who inhabited this landscape developed a sophisticated understanding of their environment. They built irrigation systems, managed their agricultural resources, and maintained the delicate balance necessary to support a growing population within the constraints of their geographical region. By the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era, the Mycenaeans had established themselves as the dominant power in the Aegean world. Multiple palace centers existed, each controlling its own territory, yet all sharing a common culture, a common language, and common artistic traditions. Whether these palace centers were independent kingdoms or provinces of a larger empire remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is clear is that the Mycenaeans had created a civilization of genuine sophistication, one that would endure for centuries, that would develop trade networks spanning thousands of miles, and that would eventually become the subject of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature. This was the world that Homer would later mythologize. These were the people who would allegedly sail to Troy. These were the rulers, the warriors, and the kingdoms that would inspire the epic tales of the Trojan War. But before we can understand those legends, we must understand the reality from which they emerged. By 1400 before the Common Era, the Mycenaean civilization had entered its moment of greatest achievement. The late Helladic III period, spanning from approximately 1400 to 1100 BC, represented the apex of Bronze Age Greek culture. The palace centers that had emerged from earlier foundations now dominated the landscape of the Peloponnese with an authority that seemed unshakable. Mycenae itself stood as the undisputed heart of this world, its massive stone fortifications climbing the slopes of its acropolis like the work of titans. Yet, this was also the moment when the seeds of transformation were being sown, when the forces that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world were beginning to gather momentum. The architectural ambitions of the Mycenaean elite had reached extraordinary heights during this period. The cyclopean walls that surrounded the palace centers were not merely defensive structures, but declarations of power and permanence. These massive blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, were fitted together with such precision that later Greeks would attribute their construction to the mythological Cyclopes, giants of superhuman strength. The engineering required to move, shape, and position such stones represented a profound understanding of physics and labor organization. The construction of these fortifications demanded resources, coordination, and sustained commitment across generations. The very stones themselves became a form of written language, speaking across centuries about the ambitions and capabilities of those who built them. At Tiryns, located near Mycenae, at coordinates 37.5983 degrees north and 22.7953 degrees east, archaeologists uncovered similar monumental architecture. The palace complexes at both sites revealed sophisticated planning and construction techniques. The megaron, the characteristic large rectangular hall that served as the ceremonial and administrative heart of these palaces, demonstrated the standardization of Mycenaean architectural principles. These spaces were designed to impress, to intimidate, and to facilitate the gathering of subordinate elites who acknowledged the authority of the palace center's rulers. The linear B tablets discovered at Pylos in southwestern Greece, located at 37.0278 degrees north and 21.6953 degrees east, provide an extraordinary window into the functioning of these palace economies. Excavated under the direction of Carl Blegen during the mid-20th century, these clay tablets were preserved by the very fires that destroyed the palaces they documented. Written in a syllabic script that scholars eventually deciphered in the 1950s, the tablets reveal an administrative apparatus of remarkable complexity. They recorded the movement of goods, the allocation of land, the management of textile production, the organization of religious ceremonies, and the mobilization of military resources. What emerges from careful study of these tablets is a picture of palace economies operating at an unprecedented scale of sophistication. Scribes recorded not merely transactions, but entire systems of redistribution and resource management. The palaces controlled vast estates, maintained fleets of craftspeople, organized religious festivals, and coordinated military preparations. The economy was not driven by the accumulation of private wealth, but by the centralized management of resources flowing through the palace bureaucracy. Goods moved along established pathways, recorded and tracked at each stage. The palaces functioned as the nexus through which all significant economic activity passed. The warrior culture that defined Mycenaean society reached its zenith during this period. The shaft graves of earlier centuries had given way to tholos tombs, magnificent beehive structures that housed the elite dead and their precious grave goods. These tombs contained armor, weapons, and chariots that spoke to the martial preoccupations of the ruling classes. The frescoes that decorated the palace walls depicted hunting scenes and religious ceremonies, but also warriors in formation, charioteers commanding their vehicles, and the apparatus of military organization. The Mycenaeans had developed a sophisticated system of chariot warfare that required extensive training, specialized equipment, and significant economic investment. The trade networks that connected the Mycenaean world to distant regions had expanded dramatically by this period. Mycenaean pottery has been discovered in Egypt, in the Levantine coast, in Anatolia, and throughout the Mediterranean islands. This distribution was not accidental, but the result of deliberate commercial expansion and diplomatic contact. Mycenaean merchants and warriors traveled to foreign courts, and foreign merchants came to the palace centers seeking Mycenaean goods. The palaces controlled access to these trade networks, granting privileges to certain merchants and maintaining monopolies on particularly valuable commodities. Bronze, that essential material that defined the entire Bronze Age, flowed into the Mycenaean world from Cyprus and Anatolia. Tin, equally essential for creating bronze, traveled from distant sources through intermediaries and trading posts. The palaces grew wealthy from their control of this commerce, and their wealth in turn allowed them to expand their military capabilities and architectural ambitions. Yet even as the Mycenaean civilization reached these heights, transformations of a more subtle nature were occurring. The climate during the Mycenaean period was generally similar to the Mediterranean climate of today, with warm summers and mild winters, but this stability could not be taken for granted. Environmental factors were beginning to shift in ways that would have profound consequences. Scholars have identified evidence of climatic disruption during the Late Bronze Age, including drought conditions that affected agricultural production across the eastern Mediterranean. These environmental stresses began to place strain on palace economies that had been designed to function in conditions of relative stability. Around 1200 before the Common Era, as the late Helladic 3B period reached its culmination, the Mycenaean world faced its first major crisis. This was the period when, according to scholarly consensus, the Trojan War, if it occurred, would have taken place. Some evidence suggests that this conflict may have been inspired by real events, though scholars continue to debate the exact historical basis for the Homeric narratives. What is clear from the archaeological record is that during this period, military activity intensified across the Mediterranean. The Linear B tablets from this era contain numerous references to military preparations, the mobilization of troops, and the organization of naval forces. The palace at Pylos, with its well-preserved structures and extensive tablet archives, provides crucial evidence for understanding this moment of crisis. The tablets discovered there record the disposition of troops, the assignment of military personnel to various stations, and the collection of military supplies. These documents suggest that Pylos was preparing for a significant military engagement, mobilizing its resources and organizing its defensive capabilities. Whether this preparation was directed toward external threats or internal conflicts remains a subject of scholarly interpretation, but the intensity of the military organization is undeniable. During this same period, a mysterious and powerful force began to make its presence felt throughout the Mediterranean world. The Sea Peoples, as later Egyptian sources would call them, began their incursions into established territories. These maritime raiders and warriors, whose origins remain debated among scholars, attacked coastal settlements, disrupted trade networks, and challenged the established order. The Sea Peoples were not a unified political entity, but rather a confederation of maritime peoples from various sources, some from the Aegean Islands, some from Anatolia, some from regions that remain uncertain. They arrived in coordinated naval expeditions, bringing not merely soldiers, but families, possessions, and the intention to establish new settlements. The Mycenaean response to these threats was to strengthen their military capabilities and fortify their positions. The Linear B tablets from this period show increased military activity, the stockpiling of supplies, and the organization of defensive systems. The palace centers began to concentrate resources on military preparation, drawing wealth and labor away from other activities. The sophisticated economic systems that had been built up over centuries were being repurposed toward the demands of warfare and defense. This transformation, while perhaps necessary in the face of external threat, represented a fundamental shift in how the palace economies operated. By approximately 1100 before the Common Era, the Bronze Age collapse had begun in earnest. The Mycenaean civilization, which had seemed so firmly established and powerful, began to fragment. Major centers were destroyed, their palaces burned, their administrative systems shattered. Mycenae itself, though it continued to be inhabited, lost its preeminent position. Tiryns experienced catastrophic destruction. The palace at Pylos was abandoned, but not before a final set of tablets was inscribed, perhaps in the desperate final days of the palace's existence, recording the last commands of its administrators. The exact causes of the Bronze Age collapse remain subjects of scholarly investigation and debate. Environmental factors, including the climate disruption that had been building for decades, created agricultural stress that undermined the economic foundations of the palace systems. The invasions by the Sea Peoples, whether as cause or symptom, certainly contributed to the military and political instability. Internal societal issues, including the concentration of power in the palace centers and the potential for social resistance to palace authority, may have weakened the cohesion of Mycenaean society. The truth likely involved a combination of these factors, each reinforcing the others, creating a cascade of failures that no single institution could withstand. What is remarkable, however, is not merely the collapse, but what was lost in that collapse. The Linear B writing system, which had served the palace administrators so faithfully, disappeared from use. The sophisticated artistic traditions that had produced the magnificent frescoes and decorated pottery gave way to simpler forms. The extensive trade networks fragmented. The palace centers, which had been the focus of cultural, economic, and religious life, were abandoned. The civilization that had seemed to promise an enduring Bronze Age order instead entered a period known as the Greek Dark Ages, centuries during which the material evidence of cultural achievement becomes sparse and difficult to interpret. Yet this was not the end of the Mycenaean story, but rather a transformation. The collapse of the palace centers did not mean the disappearance of the people who had lived within them. Communities persisted, adapting to new circumstances, maintaining traditions in modified forms. The memory of the Mycenaean world did not vanish, but instead was transformed through oral tradition into the epics that Homer would eventually commit to writing centuries later. The great palaces became the halls of legendary heroes. The military campaigns became the foundation for epic narratives. The sophisticated administrative systems became the backdrop for stories of kings and warriors. The Trojan War, whether it had occurred as a specific historical event or was a composite memory of multiple conflicts, took on new life in the poetic imagination. This turning point, this moment of crisis and transformation, marks the boundary between the world that the Mycenaeans had built and the world that would emerge from its ruins. The achievement of the Mycenaean civilization was not negated by its collapse, but rather was preserved in a different form, carried forward through memory and cultural transmission into the classical world that would eventually look back upon it with wonder and recognition. The great palaces fell silent around 1100 before the Common Era. The civilization that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for 5 centuries entered its final chapter. The Bronze Age collapse, as scholars would later term it, was not a sudden catastrophe, but a complex unraveling, a convergence of forces that dismantled the interconnected world the Mycenaeans had built with such remarkable ingenuity and ambition. The palace at Mycenae, that towering symbol of Agamemnon's power, would be abandoned. The vast storerooms filled with linear bead tablets would see no new records added. The trading ships that once carried Mycenaean goods to Egypt, to Syria, to distant shores across the wine-dark sea would no longer depart from protected harbors. Yet, in this ending lies perhaps the most profound chapter of the Mycenaean story, not the triumph of conquest, but the enduring legacy they left behind, etched into stone, preserved in clay, and woven into the very fabric of Western civilization. The evidence for the Bronze Age collapse appears in the archaeological record with undeniable clarity. At sites across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, the late Helladic B period, roughly spanning from 1400 to 1100 before the Common Era, gives way to a dramatically different world. The great centers of Mycenaean power, Mycenae itself, Tiryns with its massive cyclopean walls, Pylos in southwestern Greece, and dozens of smaller settlements, show clear signs of destruction, abandonment, or dramatic decline around 1100 before the Common Era. The palatial administrative systems that had coordinated trade, maintained warrior armies, and collected taxes simply ceased to function. Scholars have long debated the causes of this collapse, and the evidence suggests not a single catastrophic event, but rather a perfect storm of interconnected crises. Some evidence points to environmental factors. The climate of the Mediterranean world experienced significant disruption during this period. Extended droughts may have stressed agricultural systems that sustained the palace economies. When harvests failed, the complex supply chains that fed armies and supported the aristocratic elite began to crack. The palace storerooms, once overflowing with grain, oil, and wine, could no longer meet the demands placed upon them. Simultaneously, the eastern Mediterranean witnessed the emergence of mysterious raiders known to later historians as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records from the 13th century before the Common Era mention these formidable maritime warriors attacking the Nile Delta itself. Some scholars have theorized that these Sea Peoples, their exact origins still debated among researchers, may have been involved in the disruption and destruction that befell Mycenaean centers. Whether they were raiders, refugees fleeing their own collapsing homelands, or opportunistic warriors exploiting the weakening of established powers remains a question historians continue to investigate. What seems certain is that the stable, predictable world of international trade and diplomatic relations that had characterized the late Bronze Age was fragmenting. Internal societal pressures also played a role in the Mycenaean decline. The linear bead tablets, those precious windows into palace administration, reveal societies organized around highly centralized authority. Everything flowed through the palace: grain collection, textile production, bronze working, religious practices. When the systems that maintained these hierarchies began to fail, when the palaces could no longer project power or provide the security and economic stability their populations depended upon, the entire structure became vulnerable. Archaeological evidence suggests that some sites experienced conflict and destruction, though the precise nature of these conflicts remains open to interpretation. The palace at Pylos, excavated by Carl Blegen in the mid-20th century, offers poignant testimony to this collapse. Located in southwestern Greece at approximately 37 degrees north latitude and 21 degrees 40 minutes east longitude, Pylos was one of the best-preserved Mycenaean palaces. The linear bead tablets found there, inscribed on clay and preserved by the very fires that destroyed the palace, provide a final snapshot of administrative life. These tablets record weapons inventories, personnel assignments, and economic transactions, suggesting a civilization preparing for conflict or crisis. Then the palace burned, and the records end abruptly. No later tablets were written, no new administrative records were kept, the palace was never fully rebuilt. Yet the Mycenaean collapse was not universal annihilation. In some regions, settlements persisted, though often in diminished form. In other areas, populations migrated, establishing new communities on islands or in regions less affected by the broader disruption. The knowledge, skills, and cultural practices of the Mycenaeans did not vanish, but were transformed, passed down through oral tradition, embedded in artistic styles and preserved in the memories of communities that survived the transition. This transformation is where the true legacy of the Mycenaeans emerges most clearly. The civilization that had constructed those magnificent cyclopean walls, that had maintained complex trade networks reaching across the Mediterranean, that had developed a written administrative system and a sophisticated warrior culture. This civilization's achievements did not end with the collapse of the palaces. Instead, they became the foundation upon which classical Greek civilization would eventually be built. The Greeks of the classical period, emerging centuries later, did not forget the Mycenaeans, though the details became obscured by time. They remembered warriors in bronze armor, great kings who commanded mighty fortifications, cities of legendary wealth and power. They remembered the Trojan War, Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, composed sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era, drew upon this collective memory, upon traditions passed down through generations of storytellers. The war at Troy, if it occurred as some scholars propose around 1200 before the Common Era during the late Helladic 3B period, became the defining narrative of the age. Scholars continued to debate whether the Trojan War was a historical event or a mythological creation. Michael Wood, in his examination of the evidence, has suggested that the war may have been inspired by real events, perhaps a Mycenaean military expedition to the Anatolian coast. Others argue that the tale is purely mythological, a poet's invention woven from cultural memories and archetypal narrative patterns. The truth, as is often the case with ancient history, likely lies somewhere between these positions. What seems clear is that the Mycenaeans did conduct military campaigns, did maintain far-flung trade networks that brought them into contact with Troy and other Anatolian centers, and did possess the maritime capability to undertake such expeditions. The archaeological evidence supports this understanding. Mycenaean pottery has been found at Troy, indicating trade contact between the two civilizations. Fortifications at Troy show signs of destruction and rebuilding, suggesting a violent history. The warrior culture of the Mycenaeans, evidenced by the magnificent armor and weapons found in graves and palaces, speaks to a society organized around martial prowess and military competition. Yet these facts, while fascinating, do not prove the existence of a 10-year siege led by Agamemnon himself. They simply confirm that the Mycenaeans were active, militarily capable, and present in the regions where Homer's legends place them. What matters most about the Trojan War, whether historical or mythological, is what it reveals about how the Mycenaeans understood themselves. The epics present a world of honor, glory, and martial excellence. Warriors fight not merely for material gain, but for kleos, imperishable glory. The greatest of these warriors, like Achilles and Hector, achieve immortality through their deeds, their names preserved in song and story. This value system reflects something essential about Mycenaean culture: the elevation of the warrior elite, the importance of military prowess, the belief that greatness could transcend death through memory and tradition. The legacy of Mycenaean civilization extended far beyond the battlefield. Their architectural achievements influenced later Greek building practices. The Cyclopean masonry techniques, the corbelled vault construction, the massive stone fortifications. These innovations were studied and adapted by later builders. The shaft graves of the early Mycenaean period, with their contents of precious metals and elaborate grave goods, established patterns of elite burial that would persist throughout Greek history. The palace architectural arrangements, with their central megaron and surrounding rooms, influenced the design of later Greek temples and public buildings. The Linear B writing system, though it fell out of use with the collapse of the palaces, was eventually replaced by the alphabetic script that the classical Greeks adopted and refined. In this transition, the Mycenaeans' contribution to writing systems, their development of a complex notation for recording administrative information, became part of the foundation upon which Western writing traditions were built. The very fact that later scholars could study Linear B tablets and reconstruct the Mycenaean language revealed a civilization of considerable sophistication and organizational complexity. The religious practices of the Mycenaeans also influenced later Greek religion. The Linear B tablets mention many of the gods who would later populate the classical Greek pantheon. Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus, and others appear in these ancient records. The sanctuaries where the Mycenaeans worshipped became sacred sites for later Greeks. At some locations, continuity of religious practice seems to have persisted even through the disruptions of the collapse, suggesting that spiritual traditions maintained connection across the centuries of transformation. The Mycenaean trade networks, though they collapsed with the palaces, had established patterns of exchange and cultural contact that would be renewed and expanded in later periods. The Greeks of the Classical Age inherited a world already connected by maritime routes and commercial relationships. The Phoenicians, who emerged as major traders in the Iron Age following the Bronze Age collapse, would follow routes and establish ports in regions where Mycenaean merchants had once traded. The Mediterranean world that classical Greece would navigate was, in many ways, a rediscovery and renewal of connections the Mycenaeans had first established. Perhaps most profoundly, the Mycenaeans left behind the memory of what was possible. They had built a civilization that spanned the Mediterranean, that had organized thousands of people into coordinated economic and military systems, that had achieved remarkable artistic and technological accomplishments. Even as later Greeks lived through the simpler, more localized societies of the early Iron Age, they carried the knowledge that such grandeur had once existed. This memory inspired ambition. The classical Greeks, as they rebuilt and expanded their civilization, did so with awareness of the Mycenaean achievement behind them. The Linear B tablets, those clay records preserved by fire, allow us to hear the voices of the Mycenaeans across 3,000 years. They are not the grand pronouncements of kings or the eloquent speeches of heroes. Instead, they are the mundane records of administration, inventories of weapons, lists of workers, records of tax collection. Yet in these ordinary documents lies extraordinary meaning. They prove that the Mycenaeans were a real people, not mythological phantoms. They managed complex societies, made decisions about resource allocation, and kept careful records of their activities. They were human beings, with concerns both practical and profound, who built something remarkable and left traces of their achievement for future generations to discover and understand. The excavations at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, conducted by pioneers like Heinrich Schliemann, Alan Weiss, and Carl Blegen, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing into the 20th, transformed our understanding of ancient Greece. These archaeologists demonstrated that Homer's legends, while embellished and transformed by poetic imagination, had roots in historical reality. A great civilization had indeed flourished in the Aegean, had built magnificent fortifications, had conducted military campaigns, and had maintained extensive trade networks. The Mycenaeans were not inventions of poets, but creators of one of antiquity's most impressive civilizations. Today, the ruins of Mycenaean palaces stand as monuments to human achievement and to the fragility of even the most impressive civilizations. The massive Cyclopean walls at Tiryns still tower above the surrounding landscape, their construction seeming almost impossibly ambitious even to modern observers with advanced technology. The Tholos tombs at Mycenae, those beehive-shaped burial chambers, demonstrate sophisticated engineering and monumental construction. The palace at Pylos, though less imposing in its remains, yielded the treasures of Linear B writing that revolutionized our understanding of Bronze Age Greece. The Mycenaean civilization teaches us that greatness is not permanent, that the most elaborate systems can be disrupted, that the most impressive achievements can fade. Yet it also teaches us that human creativity, ingenuity, and ambition leave lasting marks. The Mycenaeans fell, their palaces were abandoned, their administrative systems ceased to function. But their influence persisted. Their memory shaped the classical Greeks who came after them. Their architectural innovations influenced later builders. Their maritime networks established patterns that would be renewed. Their gods became the gods of classical religion. Their warrior values influenced the ideals of later Greek culture. In the final analysis, the Mycenaeans represent a crucial bridge in Western history. They were sophisticated, organized, and ambitious. They built on foundations laid by the Minoans of Crete and the earlier Indo-European peoples of the mainland. They created something distinctly their own, a warrior culture with administrative sophistication, a civilization that combined martial prowess with economic organization and artistic achievement. When they fell, around 1100 before the Common Era, they did not simply disappear. Instead, they transformed, their legacy flowing into the classical Greek civilization that would become foundational to Western culture. The truth behind the Trojan War, then, is not the truth of historical accuracy or poetic invention alone. It is the truth of cultural memory, of how a civilization understands itself and creates narratives to explain its own origins and significance. The Mycenaeans did not need Homer to validate their importance or legitimize their existence. They built cities that endured, maintained systems that functioned, and achieved accomplishments that impressed even those who came centuries after them. Yet Homer's legends, by preserving the memory of Mycenaean greatness and embedding it in narrative form, ensured that the Mycenaean achievement would never be forgotten. In the end, the Mycenaeans left us with something more valuable than gold or bronze, more lasting than fortified walls or palatial treasures. They left us with the knowledge that human beings can organize themselves into complex societies, can build remarkable things, can create systems of meaning and value that transcend their own time. They left us with the understanding that civilizations rise and fall, but their influence persists, shaping the future even as they fade into the past. The Mycenaeans remind us that we are all part of a continuous human story, connected across millennia to those who came before and those who will come after. In discovering their truth, we discover something about ourselves, about our capacity for creation, our vulnerability to circumstance, and our enduring need to remember and honor those who built the foundations upon which we stand.